This here is my old gaming PC that I built back in 2014. It is a 4th generation Intel Haswell system. The system has changed and evolved quite a bit over the years. It is my most modified computer to date. The motherboard is a Gigabyte Z97 Gaming 3, nothing fancy, and the original processor was the i7-4790 non-K, which I later upgraded to the i7-4790K variant. The graphics card was originally a GTX 770 that just artifacted and died on me after a year and a half. That got replaced by a GTX 960 4GB variant, and later down the line I replaced that with a Radeon RX 6600, which you can see in this video. The second GPU down there is a GTX 465 that I was using for some niche purposes, which I could do a follow-up video about, but for the purposes of this video I will be removing it from the system. The rest of the components are 24GB of generic 1600 MHz DDR3 RAM that I gathered over the years, a 1TB SATA SSD, a 650W PSU that I think might be on its way out, and finally, cooling the flagship i7-4790K is a Be Quiet Dark Rock 4. I had stopped using this system back around 2017 and given it to my father. He happily used it to play some single player games that he liked, but around 2021 he wanted to play Resident Evil Village, but unfortunately the GTX 960 wasn't really cutting it. That's when the RX 6600 came to replace the GTX 960. Last year he changed his computer for a far more powerful modern AM5 system and given the 2014 machine back to me. So as it stands, I haven't done any serious gaming on this machine close to 8 years at this point. My goal here is to benchmark the system against some up-to-date live service multiplayer games and some tough-to-run single-player games that came out over the last 10 years or so and see how it holds up in 2026. The operating system of choice is Windows 11 24H2 IoT LTSC version. The regular versions of Windows 11 do not support these older CPUs and make a big fuss during the installation process. The IoT LTSC version installs with zero complaints and does not contain any of the bloated AI stuff that comes with the regular versions. This does free up the CPU and the RAM while the system is running. I briefly tried overclocking the CPU to 4.7 GHz and the memory to 1800 MHz, but the performance gains were negligible at best, so I decided to run stock settings for this video. The Windows Spectre and Meltdown patches were also disabled for all of the benchmarks in order to maximize the potential of the CPU. All of the in-game footage was captured using the X265 hardware encoding on the RX 6600 via OBS. This has minimal impact on game performance when fully GPU bound, so if you have an identical system, you may get slightly better performance in a non-screen recording session. I wanted to start with some 3D Mark benchmarks. TimeSpy gave us a score of 6,844, Steel Nomad gave us 1,446, and Steel Nomad Lite gave us 6,759. All the scores were stated to be slightly below the averages for an RX 6600. This might be because we are running the card at PCIe Gen 3 X8 due to our older motherboard as opposed to a Gen 4 X8 support that a modern motherboard would have. But all throughout the benchmarks, both CPU and GPU were being nearly fully utilized, indicating a good pairing between the two. Moving on to actual game benchmarks, first up is the finals using the Unreal Engine 5. And immediately when booting up the game, we came across one of the banes of these older CPUs, the shader compilation step. The whole process took about 9.5 minutes. Anyway, for the first match I set all of the graphics to their respective lowest settings and the resolution to 1080p. After that I enabled FSR 3.1 native AA for anti-aliasing and image clarity. And we have a very solid start here. The game is hovering around 90 FPS during the initial combat, with GPU usage jumping between 70% and 95%, which indicates that our CPU and DDR3 RAM are limiting factors in this game. You might also notice some weird jerky mouse movement. I was afraid that it was CPU related, but turns out that it was my wireless mouse deciding not to work properly. After switching to a wired mouse, the problem went away. I swear, I have the most terrible connectivity problems when it comes to wireless peripherals. I don't know why I keep purchasing them. This first match returned an average of 96.2 FPS with 1% lows of 49.3, and there wasn't any major stuttering or hitching that I saw that negatively affected the game experience. For match number 2, I decided to bump up the texture settings to medium as there was some VRAM left unused on the GPU during the first match, and I also didn't want the surfaces in the game to look like lentil soup. The initial performance for the second match, which was on a different map, was hovering around 80s during combat. I have a sneaking suspicion that the drop in average was due to the map itself, as this was a more dense urban map with tons of destruction going on. I later grabbed a flamethrower to really try to stress out the GPU. The benchmark results from the second match were an average FPS of 85.9 and 1% lows were 45.5. So overall, the finals managed to average 91.05 FPS with very little to no stuttering on the system. The only downside was the near 10-minute waiting time for shader compilation. Apart from that, I would rate this as an enjoyable and fully playable experience. It seemed like the i7-4790K was barely keeping up with the RX 6600, and an FPS cap around 80 would have really smoothed out the gameplay and given the CPU some breathing room. For benchmark number 2, we have here Doom Eternal using the id Tech 7 engine. I had originally played this game on a laptop with a GTX 1050 Ti mobile, and I remember having to set things to medium at 720p in order to consistently get above 60 FPS. But I have quite a bit more faith in this system, as the RX 6600 is really comparable to a GTX 1080 or a GTX 1070 Ti in terms of raster performance. So I have the game set to the Ultra preset at 1080p, no upscaling or dynamic resolution, and hopped into the Super Gore Nest map and played the initial combat encounter. First impressions were amazing. The game is averaging well over 100 FPS even in the heat of combat. The controls feel super smooth and responsive, but there is some occasional stutter that goes away, which indicates shader compilation. It is annoying when it happens, but it would go away as you played a few levels of the game in a normal scenario, so not a huge deal breaker. This first benchmark averaged 134.2 FPS with 1% lows of 44.7. I noticed that the GPU was nearly always at 99% usage, indicating that the i7-4790K was not bottlenecking the RX 6600 for this title. For the second benchmark, I decided to turn on ray tracing, since the RX 6600 is a ray tracing capable card as opposed to the GTX 1080. On the Ultra preset at 1080p and ray tracing turned on, the second run had a significant drop in performance. The averages had dropped down to around 60 FPS, but hey, at least we can see our reflections on the glass. I noticed during this run that VRAM usage was almost maxing out, and I even had a very nasty freeze in combat, probably due to VRAM filling. The responsiveness and the smoothness of the controls were noticeably worse this time around, but it wasn't anything unplayable. The averages of the second benchmark was down to 70.7 FPS and 1% were down to 43.7. For the third benchmark run, I decided to try using FSR4, which the RX 6600 kind of supports. In order to enable FSR4, you need to be at least running the AMD 26.3.1 drivers, then you need to find the community version of the FSR Int 8 version that is floating online. After that, you need to download and use the amazing program called OptiScaler to inject FSR4 into the game disguised as DLSS. So the game thinks that it's running DLSS, but under the hood, OptiScaler is running this special version of FSR4 that works with the RX 6600. Really cool stuff. And here is where I ran into a little bit of a problem. Normally pressing the insert key should bring up a menu in-game for OptiScaler, but for whatever reason Doom Eternal does not like that. Luckily, you can just edit the optiscaler.ini file that it creates with a text editor, and voila, now we are running FSR 4.0.2 quality at 1080p ultra settings with ray tracing enabled. And this last benchmark run, the FPS similarly averaged around 60 FPS with maybe a slightly imperceptible performance boost. The responsiveness and the smoothness of the game was very much similar to the last run, but I did not encounter that nasty freeze that happened. So FSR 4 may have cleared up some VRAM by running the game at a lower resolution and got rid of the freezing. The image quality was also imperceptible to native 1080p, or at least I wasn't able to see the difference. However, there was some ghosting artifacts that I kind of noticed, but more on that later in a different benchmark. This last benchmark average returned as 74.1 FPS and 1% lows with 53.1, so an objective uplift that is hard to differentiate. I would personally choose to play Doom Eternal at ultra settings native 1080p with well over 100 FPS, but for those who are looking for that ray tracing eye candy, the game is perfectly playable with over 60 FPS if you choose to enable ray tracing. Maybe drop the settings down to high from ultra first before trying to inject FSR 4. And throughout all of these benchmarks, the GPU was nearly always at a 99% usage, indicating that the i7-4790K was able to keep up with the RX 6600. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, a very popular online game that is constantly being updated, and it uses Valve's brand new Source 2 engine. Now, I did this benchmark right after the game got a major overhaul regarding its animation systems, and people have been saying that this has resulted in a performance boost for most systems. The graphics settings are all at their respective lowest at 1080p native with no upscaling. For the benchmark, I queued into a Dust 2 deathmatch online. For whatever reason, the MSI Afterburner doesn't want to run on CS2, but the Steam performance overlay on the top right does show the performance graph of the game just fine, so I used that. By the end of the match, the average FPS had reached 159 with 1% lows of 43. The game felt okay to play, not the smoothest in terms of aiming and tracking, but it was good enough that I was having fun. Keep in mind that a modern system can average well over 200 FPS in CS2, so you would be at a significant disadvantage with this old system. Also, the GPU usage is constantly hovering around 60%, meaning that the CPU is just unable to keep up with the RX 6600 in this title. CS2 certainly shows the age of the system, but if this was the only PC I had, then I'm sure I would have had fun playing casual modes and in silver or low gold lobbies in competitive play every now and then. Next, I decided to benchmark Deus Ex Mankind Divided, a game that was really hard to run smoothly over 60 FPS back when it came out. I used the in-game benchmark to first test out the high preset at 1080p, which gave an average FPS of 94.1 and a 1% low of 1 FPS due to a massive freeze, most likely a shader compile. The 1% low before that stutter was a healthy 59. I also noticed that the GPU wasn't hitting the 99% usage quite enough due to a CPU bottleneck. So I decided to do a second benchmark, and for that I switched the ultra settings at 1080p native, and this time the GPU was nearly at 99% usage and the benchmark averaged a 83.8 FPS with 1% lows of 60.5. And finally, I decided to do a quick run through of the game's initial opening mission at Ultra 1080p native, trying my best to get into combat. And that averaged around 111.8 FPS with 1% lows of 56.7, with the GPU being mostly at 99% usage. It appears that this game is really heavy on the CPU, but the i7-4790K can comfortably go through the game and render more than 60 FPS, perfectly playable for an immersive sim type of game. Plus, this game still looks gorgeous at ultra settings despite releasing back in 2016. To spice things up a bit, the next benchmark is one of my favorite online games, Hunt Showdown 1896, which uses the latest version of CryEngine, which I believe is CryEngine 5.11. For the first benchmark run, I set all the graphics to their absolute lowest at 1080p with no upscaling and queued to a bounty hunt. I immediately ran into a duo and a pack of dogs plus a meathead. Despite my best efforts, I got my skill issues handed to me and was sent back to the lobby in shame. Still, the benchmark average was 104.3 FPS with 1% lows of 63.0. The GPU usage was hovering around 70%, indicating a CPU bottleneck. Therefore, for the second benchmark run, I enabled the medium preset at 1080p, no upscaling, and queued into a bounty clash with random teammates. We immediately got into a crossfire with two other teams, and despite everyone's best efforts, just got shot like fish in a barrel and got sent back to the lobby. I still think this is one of the best online games that you can play. Anyway, the second benchmark averaged 107.6 FPS with 1% low of 57 FPS. I did notice the GPU usage jumped around to 80%, but this still means that the CPU is bottlenecking and one could theoretically push the GPU intensive settings to get better visuals. Overall, the game felt okay to play. It is certainly impressive that this old CPU can average over 100 FPS, whereas the PS5 version of the game is capped at 60 FPS. I think Hunt could still be tweaked to look better and capped around 75 FPS with more load on the GPU and less on the CPU for an overall better experience. Another modern game in the benchmark suite is the Dead Space remake using the Frostbite engine. I remember at launch this game being notoriously VRAM hungry and having annoying shader compilation stutter during gameplay. Despite running an initial shader compilation step when launching the game, which thankfully took only 3 minutes on the i7-4790K, there were still some random stutters throughout the gameplay. For the first benchmark, I set the game to the low preset at 1080p with no upscaling and used the initial opening scene for the benchmark as it is a bit more demanding compared to the actual game. This gave us an average of 56.9 FPS with 1% lows of 38.7, which was a bit of a hit on my morale. The game was consistently using more than 90% of the GPU, which means we can potentially get more performance as there is no CPU bottleneck. Next, I tried the medium preset at 1080p native, and there wasn't much of a performance difference. The average was 52.8 FPS with 1% lows of 34.5, and the VRAM usage was around 6GB of our total 8, so medium preset seems to be the way to go. Next, I decided to inject FSR4 into the game using OptiScaler. With medium preset at 1080p FSR 4.0.2 at quality, we averaged 64.6 FPS and 1% lows of 43.5 FPS, which is an amazing boost in performance. But you might have noticed the problem on the screen. Yeah, FSR4 looks broken. Everything is leaving behind this ghosting trail and the image is noticeably worse. Turns out this is a bug with FSR 4.0.2 on the RX 6000 series cards. It works fine on 7000 series cards, but it does ghosting and stuff on the 6000 series. And that was also happening in Doom Eternal footage as well, but I think the game's colors and art style lends itself better for the ghosting to mask itself. But all is not lost. Turns out this is not the end for our RX 6600. The amazing OptiScaler team has modified the Int8 version of FSR 4.0.2 to fix the ghosting issues on the 6000 series cards. And they have released it as FSR 4.0.2b version. All I had to do was go online, download the 4.0.2b version, copy paste it into the folder, and voila, image quality is fixed, and honestly it is looking amazing. We also might have got a tiny bit of a performance boost with averages of 67.3 FPS and 1% lows of 44.1 FPS, but that could easily be run-to-run variation. Overall, I think FSR4 quality with settings at medium, perhaps with a few settings pushed to high without filling the VRAM, is the way to play the game with an RX 6600. Also, the i7-4790K wasn't even a bottleneck in this game, which is awesome news for our old system. Dark Souls 3 is up next, and you might say, well, this is an old game that is easy to run, but I remember playing this game with a GTX 770 and only being able to get about 40 FPS with medium settings at 1080p. Now, years down the line, with the system upgraded with an RX 6600, we are getting a nearly locked 60 FPS with max settings at 1080p, which feels amazing. I played through the tutorial boss and ran all the way to the second bonfire on the high wall of Lothric. The game still looks breathtaking with amazing art direction, but the anti-aliasing leaves a bit to be desired. That can potentially be solved by injecting SMAA or FXAA using Reshade, but since DS3 is an online game, that might get you flagged as cheating, so I did not risk using it. The game, as it is on this system, is perfectly playable, averaging a 59.8 FPS with 1% low of 51.5 FPS. Not even the dragon breathing fire was enough to bring our frame rate averages down. I just wish the game had an option to uncap your frame rate, as both the GPU and CPU were being underutilized. And finally, last but not least, a blast from the past, Assassin's Creed Unity. Yes, this game came out in 2014, the same era that our i7-4790 also came out. Those who were around may remember that this game was notoriously buggy and was nearly impossible to get running at 60 FPS. But with years of patches and bug fixes and a huge GPU upgrade, can our i7-4790K system do the impossible and get 60 FPS in Unity? With all settings maxed, even the ones labeled for NVIDIA GPUs, at 1080p, our answer is yes! The top-of-the-line gaming CPU from the time when this game came out now averages at 92.3 FPS with 1% lows of 58.3. You can see that the game load often switches between the GPU and the CPU, with dense crowds maxing out the CPU and getting high on rooftops maxes out the GPU. Technically, this still may indicate that the game is a mess of optimization, but with crowds this dense on the street, I cannot really complain. The game rarely drops from 60 FPS, and atmosphere it provides is really unparalleled. I have maybe only seen this much crowds in Hitman Blood Money and the recent Hitman reboot games. This benchmark was really out of curiosity and more for fun, but I was genuinely surprised at how well this machine holds up in 2026, especially in modern up-to-date online games such as Hunt, Showdown and The Finals. One thing I noticed was the GPU was hitting 90 degrees Celsius on the hotspot, and that definitely annoyed me a bit, but that is to be expected in this cramped office style case with minimal airflow. Perhaps a minor undervolt and underclock would see the hotspot temperatures fall with minimal performance losses. I am also well aware that I did not test many of the latest and greatest games that have released, but that really comes down to me not owning most newly released games. I try to be financially responsible. I don't earn enough to throw $60 at every newly released game. With PC component prices going through the roof, it may not be such a bad idea to look for these old alternative machines, as they can be very capable gaming systems with some upgrades. If there is further interest, I may also do a follow-up video explaining what I do with the dual GPU setup using the ancient GTX 465 on this machine. If you have enjoyed this different video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Please take care of yourselves and goodbye.